Sudan is one of Africa's largest countries, and its region, known as Darfur, has recently become synonymous with tragedy and human suffering. To understand why this terrible crisis unfolded in Darfur, we need to first understand what Darfur is and who lives there. When Darfur was annexed by the British in 1916 and later became part of Sudan, the region's governance shifted dramatically. Instead of local rule through traditional systems, the central government took greater control. This shift changed the delicate balance of power between ethnic groups. When Sudan became independent from Britain in 1956, power became concentrated in the north, especially around the capital city Khartoum. This northern elite was predominantly Arab, and they systematically marginalized people from Darfur and other regions. For generations, Darfur's people managed their land through traditional systems known as the Dar system and the Hakura system. Under the Dar system, land belonged to specific tribes or clans, each having its clearly defined territories. This meant the Fur, Masalit, and other African groups had designated areas, which helped avoid conflicts by clearly defining borders. The Hakura system was similar, but instead of land ownership, certain families or groups had rights to collect taxes and manage the land. While these systems worked for a long time, things began to change drastically in the second half of the 20th century. One major factor was population growth. From the 1970s to the early 2000s, the population in Darfur grew almost 5 times larger. With more people came greater demands on limited resources. Farmland became scarce, and water sources started to dry up due to long periods of drought and desertification. This environmental crisis pushed northern Darfuri people southward, often causing disputes over land with the local populations already settled there. In addition, large-scale agricultural projects emerged, driven by Sudan's central government. These projects required vast areas of land, which the government took from local people without respecting traditional land rights. This action upset many local Darfuris, who saw their ancestral lands being handed to outsiders, often wealthy elites from the northern part of Sudan. As farms expanded, traditional grazing routes for nomadic herders became blocked, forcing them onto land belonging to farmers, which resulted in frequent conflicts. Another factor making the situation worse was a law introduced in 1970 called the Unregistered Land Act. This law stated that any land without official government paperwork automatically became government property. Most traditional land in Darfur had never been formally registered because people relied on local customary rules and traditions instead. When this law came into effect, it allowed people from other regions, particularly northern Sudan, to claim Darfuri land with government backing. The traditional ways of managing disputes and keeping peace were also weakened by the government abolishing local administrative roles in 1971, leaving no clear way to handle land disputes peacefully. The outcome was predictable. Tensions increased dramatically between Darfur's various ethnic communities. Many local Darfuris felt threatened by outsiders taking their land, while northern migrants saw new opportunities to secure valuable resources. Local communities began turning away migrants, fearing they would permanently take their lands, leading to heightened tensions and occasional violence. The government itself often actively worsened these tensions, taking sides based on ethnicity and using these disputes for its own political benefit. By the 1990s, Darfur was already a tense and volatile region. People who once peacefully coexisted found themselves increasingly at odds due to scarcity, environmental changes, and unjust government policies. Ethnic identity became a dividing line, with Arab groups often portrayed as favored by the government and non-Arab African groups feeling systematically discriminated against. This uneven distribution of power had severe consequences for the people of Darfur. Although most Darfuris were Muslim, just like the ruling northern elite, their ethnic identity was primarily African, rather than Arab. Because of this difference, people in Darfur felt excluded politically, economically, and socially. Schools and hospitals were scarce or non-existent in many parts of Darfur. Roads and public transport were minimal, and opportunities to advance economically were almost impossible to find. Many Darfuris felt the government treated them as second-class citizens simply because of who they were. The frustration and anger among the Darfuri population had reached a critical point. A document known as the Black Book appeared around 2000, secretly circulated by people frustrated with the government. It listed how unfairly Darfur and other regions were being treated. This document became hugely influential because it clearly demonstrated that power in Sudan was controlled by a small group of northern Arab elites who systematically ignored the needs of other regions. As anger and frustration grew, the people of Darfur started to organize politically. Young, educated Darfuris, who saw no future under the current government, decided peaceful protests were not enough. They believed armed resistance was the only way to achieve justice. Two main rebel groups emerged: the Sudan Liberation Movement, or SLM, and the Justice and Equality Movement, or JEM. These groups were made up mostly of people from African ethnic groups, such as the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa, who had been marginalized and mistreated by the government. In February 2003, violence officially erupted when these rebel groups launched attacks on Sudanese government bases, police stations, and military posts. At first, their actions surprised the government. Rebel groups managed to defeat Sudanese army units and even captured significant amounts of weapons and supplies. The government, however, quickly responded, but not in the way many expected. Instead of negotiating or addressing the grievances that had caused the rebellion, the Sudanese government decided to crush the rebellion by force. However, because its army was already engaged in conflicts in southern and eastern Sudan, it did not have enough troops to handle another major war. So, the government turned to local militias to fight the rebels. These militias, known as the Janjaweed, were mostly Arab nomads who already had tense relationships with African farming communities in Darfur. The name Janjaweed literally means devils on horseback. Originally, the Janjaweed were informal groups of Arab herders who were armed by the government to protect borders from threats coming from Chad. Now, the Sudanese government intentionally armed, trained, and funded these militias to attack the Darfuri rebels and the communities supporting them. By doing this, the government knowingly escalated local disputes into a massive ethnic conflict. The government provided the Janjaweed with guns, ammunition, communication equipment, vehicles, and even helicopters and aircraft support. In many attacks, government aircraft would first bomb villages, after which the Janjaweed militias would move in to attack survivors, steal their property, burn houses, and terrorize the local population. There was clear and undeniable coordination between the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed militias. The Janjaweed were ruthless in their attacks. They targeted entire communities based on ethnic identity. African groups, particularly the Fur, Masalit, and Zahawa, suffered the most brutal violence. The militias burned villages to the ground, destroyed crops, and poisoned wells, making it impossible for people to return home. In a short period, hundreds of thousands of Darfuris fled their villages, desperately seeking safety from the relentless attacks. As violence escalated, life in Darfur rapidly became a nightmare for millions of people. The brutality carried out by militias, with the support of Sudan's government, reached unimaginable levels. Villages became targets, families were torn apart, and entire communities lived in constant fear. From 2003 onwards, the Janjaweed militias launched a deliberate campaign to remove specific ethnic groups from their homes. These groups, mainly the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa, faced systematic attacks aimed at forcing them to abandon their lands forever. This process, known internationally as ethnic cleansing, involved completely destroying villages and making it impossible for people to return. One common tactic used by the Janjaweed was the scorched earth policy. They would invade villages, burn down houses, destroy crops, and poison water supplies. The intention was clear: destroy everything that people needed to survive. Once villages were burned, the Janjaweed would loot any remaining possessions, stealing livestock, valuables, and even basic items like cooking utensils and clothes. Survivors had no choice but to flee, leaving behind homes they had lived in for generations. One of the most devastating weapons used against Darfuri communities was sexual violence. Janjaweed militias, often with government soldiers, carried out widespread and systematic rape. These acts were not isolated or random. They were planned and intended to break the spirit of communities. Women, from young girls as young as 5 to elderly women in their 70s, were brutally assaulted. These attacks often occurred in front of family members, causing deep trauma and humiliation. Survivors shared heartbreaking stories. Many women described being kidnapped during raids and held captive by militias. Some were forced into sexual slavery, subjected to repeated attacks, and made to perform forced labor for weeks or even months. Those who managed to escape often found their suffering continued because their communities sometimes rejected them due to shame or stigma. This added another layer of pain, as survivors struggled not only with physical and psychological trauma, but also with isolation from their own people. Children in Darfur also faced unimaginable horrors. Many children lost parents or family members during attacks, leaving them orphaned and vulnerable. The violence also included torture and deliberate cruelty. Captives were regularly subjected to beatings, electric shocks, and severe humiliation. Prisoners who survived these brutalities described being held in overcrowded and filthy conditions, starved, and denied basic medical care. For example, one survivor from the Zaghawa tribe recounted being imprisoned in Ardumta, where daily beatings and torture were routine. He described how each day felt like death was at his doorstep. In addition to direct violence, displacement became a major humanitarian crisis. Millions of Darfuris fled their homes, desperate to escape the militias. Many people walked for days through deserts and dangerous areas, facing hunger, thirst, and attacks along the way. Thousands died during these journeys, with bodies sometimes left unburied along roads and pathways. The lucky ones who survived reached refugee camps, where their struggle continued. Life in these camps was, and still remains, extremely difficult. Conditions were terrible, with not enough food, water, or shelter for everyone. People lived in crowded, makeshift tents, exposed to extreme weather conditions and disease outbreaks. Medical care was minimal, and people often died from preventable illnesses like cholera, measles, or malaria. International aid groups tried desperately to provide relief, but the sheer number of displaced people overwhelmed resources. Even in these refugee camps, safety was not guaranteed. The Janjaweed militias sometimes attacked camps directly, stealing supplies meant for refugees and carrying out further violence. Women and children remained especially vulnerable to attack. The government often obstructed aid deliveries, blocking food and medicine from reaching those who needed it most. This created additional suffering, as people faced starvation and disease without help. This continuous campaign of violence had a clear goal: to permanently change the ethnic makeup of Darfur. By destroying villages, terrorizing communities, and driving people from their ancestral lands, the militias intended to ensure that specific ethnic groups would never return. Human rights organizations and international courts later identified these actions as clear cases of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Despite widespread international outrage and repeated condemnations, the abuses continued for years. The government of Sudan consistently denied responsibility, dismissing evidence and accusing international observers of exaggeration or bias. However, overwhelming evidence, eyewitness accounts, satellite imagery, and testimony from survivors proved beyond doubt that these atrocities occurred systematically and with clear coordination between the militias and the Sudanese government. As reports of horrific violence and human suffering reached the global community, there was growing pressure on governments and international organizations to respond. People around the world watched in horror, wondering how such atrocities could happen in modern times, and many demanded immediate action to stop the violence in Darfur. The International Criminal Court quickly opened investigations and began gathering evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Investigators interviewed survivors, collected testimonies, and documented abuses. Their findings led to arrest warrants being issued against key individuals involved in the violence. Among those indicted were Sudan's former president, Omar al-Bashir, government ministers, military commanders, and militia leaders. Al-Bashir became the first sitting president ever charged by the International Criminal Court with genocide and crimes against humanity. Despite these warrants, arresting and prosecuting suspects proved extremely difficult. Sudan's government refused to cooperate, denying that any crimes had been committed and rejecting the International Criminal Court's authority. Al-Bashir himself traveled freely to many countries without facing arrest, highlighting the challenges in enforcing international justice. Nevertheless, the indictment of these leaders sent a powerful message. It told the world that those responsible for atrocities in Darfur would face consequences, even if delayed. This gave hope to survivors and victims' families, who desperately wanted justice and accountability for their suffering. To this day, Darfur's population still lives with the devastating consequences of these crimes. Millions remain displaced, families continue searching for missing loved ones, and entire generations suffer deep psychological scars. The abuses carried out in Darfur were not just crimes against individuals. They were deliberate attempts to destroy the very fabric of entire communities, leaving deep wounds that will take decades to heal.